From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We are bringing our troops home. The caliphate has crumbled and ISIS has been defeated.
As Vice President Mike Pence declares ISIS has been defeated, 4 Americans are killed in an ISIS attack in Syria. Will this change the administration's plans for withdrawal? We'll speak with Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna about Syria, Afghanistan, and the government shutdown, which enters its 28th day, the longest in history. Then to Venezuela.
The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has finally met its match.
The United States, Brazil, and other allied nations in Latin America are ratcheting up pressure on Venezuela in what appears to be a coordinated effort to oust Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Is a coup in the works? We'll speak with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza.
And now they say that the elections were a fraud, and now they say that Maduro is not a president. That is all part of a coup d'etat in progress, encouraged and funded by the United States government.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration likely separated thousands more children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border than previously reported. That's the conclusion of the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, which said in a report Thursday that efforts to track those children have been so spotty that the exact number of family separations is unknown. Last summer, a federal judge ordered the Trump administration to reunite families separated by Trump's zero-tolerance policy along the southern border. But the Inspector General's report makes clear many migrant families were not identified or reunited as part of the judge's order. President Trump canceled a military flight Thursday that was set to deliver House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and a congressional delegation to visit NATO leaders in Brussels and U.S. troops in Afghanistan. In a letter to the Speaker, Trump wrote, quote, "In light of the 800,000 great American workers not receiving pay, I am sure you would agree that postponing this public relations event is totally appropriate." Pelosi was leading a delegation that included the chairs of the House Intelligence and Veterans Affairs Committees. Trump's 11th-hour order caused the bus carrying the delegation to turn around on its way to the airport. Trump's order drew protests from congressional Democrats, and even some Republicans criticized the move. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham said in a statement, "One sophomoric response does not deserve another," unquote. The president's retaliation came a day after Pelosi told President Trump to deliver the State of the Union address in writing from the Oval Office or at a later date. Pelosi cited security concerns caused by the government shutdown. Meanwhile, the shutdown's entered its 28th day, the longest in history, with state and local governments warning social safety net programs could soon buckle under the strain. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio warned Thursday if the shutdown stretches into March, some 1.6 million low-income New York City residents will lose benefits as the city loses $500 million a month in federal aid for food stamps, rental assistance, and school lunches.
I met with clergy leaders this morning. I asked them to prepare to help members of their congregations in every conceivable way, starting in all instances with food. But that reality of the loss of $500 million a month is just too staggering to miss. We will not be able to make people whole. We just won't.
On Capitol Hill, Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell scheduled to vote Thursday not on a bill to end the government shutdown, but on legislation to restrict abortion rights for low-income women. The No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act would have permanently barred federal funds from paying for abortions. It stalled after it failed to muster the 60 votes needed. Elsewhere, the Interior Department has recalled dozens of federal employees furloughed by the shutdown. The workers from the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management will assist in Trump's efforts to expand offshore oil and gas drilling in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans. The Bureau's offshore wind development program remains idled by the shutdown. BuzzFeed News is reporting President Trump directed his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about negotiations to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. BuzzFeed cited two unnamed federal law enforcement officials investigating the matter who also said Trump supported a plan set up by Cohen to visit Russia during the presidential campaign in order to personally meet President Vladimir Putin and jumpstart the tower negotiations. Two of Trump's children, Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr., reportedly received regular detailed updates about the project from Cohen. The chair of the House Intelligence Committee, California Democrat Adam Schiff, tweeted the President of the United States may have suborned perjury by ordering Cohen to lie to his committee. Democrats say such an order would also constitute obstruction of justice, a felony Trump's nominee to become the next Attorney General, William Barr, appeared to agree with that position during his Senate confirmation hearing Tuesday. Barr was questioned by Minnesota Democrat Amy Klobuchar.
A president persuading a person to commit perjury would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Or any person who persuades another to, yeah.
Okay. You also said that a president or any person convincing a witness to change testimony would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal reported Donald Trump ordered Michael Cohen to rig online polls in Trump's favor during the 2016 presidential campaign. Cohen reportedly paid for the service by handing the head of an IT firm a bag of cash containing more than $12,000. On Twitter, Cohen did not dispute the Wall Street Journal's report and tweeted, "What I did was at the direction of and for the sole benefit of Donald Trump," unquote. Campaign finance experts say the payment could be a criminal breach of campaign finance laws because Trump failed to report it to the Federal Elections Commission. In Bogota, Colombia, at least 21 people were killed and 68 others injured Thursday after a suicide car bomber targeted cadets at a police academy. The explosion shattered windows of nearby apartments and houses and rattled a city that hasn't seen a terror attack in years. Authorities have identified a suspect but have not identified a motive. No group has claimed responsibility for the explosion. In Sudan, security forces opened fire today on a crowd of mourners outside the home of a man who died after he was shot by authorities during an earlier protest in the capital, Khartoum. It followed the killing of two other protesters Thursday elsewhere in Khartoum, a doctor and a 16-year-old, who were both shot in the head by government forces. Protests erupted across Sudan a month ago, calling for the overthrow of the ruling National Congress Party and an end to the military regime of President Omar Hassan al-Bashir. An American journalist and news anchor for Iran's state television network, Press TV, is due in a Washington, D.C. courtroom today after she was arrested and detained by the FBI during a visit to the United States. Marzieh Hashemi, who's a U.S. citizen who lives in Tehran, was arrested at St. Louis Airport Sunday, then transferred to a prison in Washington, D.C., according to her son. The Committee to Protect Journalists says it's concerned about her arrest and called on the U.S. Department of Justice to immediately disclose the basis for her detention for the past 5 days. In Brazil, a former Rio de Janeiro police officer with ties to organized crime has been identified as the likely killer of the prominent human rights and gay rights activist, city council member Marielle Franco, who was shot dead along with her driver in Rio de Janeiro in March. According to a police report reviewed by The Intercept, 6 witnesses have identified the ex-cop as the killer. The officer, who has not been publicly named, had been kicked out of Rio's military force and now works as a mercenary for dirty politicians and others. The witnesses say the gunman did not act alone. No arrests have been made. Franco was a longtime critic of Brazil's police, who've been linked to hundreds of killings and thousands of incidents of brutality in Rio's impoverished favela neighborhoods. Back in the United States, a Chicago judge Thursday acquitted 3 police officers accused of covering up the 2014 murder of black teenager Laquan McDonald by a fellow officer. The acquittal came despite discrepancies between the 3 officers' police reports and dash cam video showing McDonald posed no threat and walked away from officers before he was shot 16 times by white police officer Jason Van Dyke. Van Dyke was convicted of second-degree murder for the shooting in October. And in California, contract negotiations between Los Angeles school district officials and the union representing more than 30,000 teachers are set to resume today after marathon talks Thursday failed to bring an end to the strike, now in its fifth day. Meanwhile, teachers in Oakland are planning a one-day wildcat strike today to protest stalled contract talks. Oakland teachers say they're struggling to make ends meet as the cost of living has risen 14% across the Bay Area over the past 5 years. Teachers are demanding a 12% pay increase over the next 3 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Syria, a suicide bomber struck a restaurant in the northern city of Manbij on Wednesday, killing 19 people, including 4 Americans. 2 of them were U.S. soldiers. The bombing was claimed by ISIS and came just weeks after President Trump declared victory over the group and ordered U.S. troops to withdraw from Syria, prompting the resignation of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Just hours after the attack, Vice President Mike Pence reiterated ISIS has been defeated.
Thanks to the leadership of this commander-in-chief and the courage and sacrifice of our armed forces, we're now actually able to begin to hand off the fight against ISIS in Syria to our coalition partners, and we are bringing our troops home. The caliphate has crumbled, and ISIS has been defeated.
Wednesday's attack in Syria drew renewed calls from congressional hawks, both Republicans and Democrats, to reverse Trump's Syria withdrawal of troops. The U.S. has an estimated 2,000 troops stationed in Syria, even though Congress has never declared war on the country. For more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Ro Khanna, Democratic congressmember from California. Last month, he wrote a piece for the Washington Post. Trump was right to pull out of Syria and Afghanistan. This is what he should do next, he wrote. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Congressmember Khanna. Your response to the attack in Manbij and what you think the U.S. response should be.
Well, first, my heart goes out to the families of the soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation and to the families of all those who lost their lives. But I think this should double our resolve to remove our troops. They are actually a sitting target for ISIS. What has happened in Syria is that ISIS used to control about 34,000 square feet of territory, and now 34,000 square miles, and now it's down to 15 kilometers. And that's not just because of Trump. It started with President Obama. So ISIS does not control much territory. We need to remove the troops, and we need to recognize that there is no military solution to a diffuse insurgency. What it will require is good intelligence work, law enforcement, and cooperation with the regional players to target the remaining insurgency.
And your comments on Pence giving this speech saying ISIS has been defeated, seemingly not understanding what had just taken place.
Well, that was just foolish and totally out of touch. I mean, the reality is there's still 20 to 30,000 ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria. The accurate statement would be to say that ISIS no longer controls much territory in Syria, and that was largely because, frankly, of the Obama administration's strategy. But you cannot fundamentally eradicate ISIS, which is diffuse and has 20 to 30,000 people across Iraq and Syria. It would require a permanent occupation of those countries, which no American wants. The only way to deal with that is to work with intelligence, with networks, to tackle the ISIS attacks that may emerge. But they do not control territory, and I think, or more than 15 kilometers, and that's, I think, what Pence should have said.
And President Trump calling for the withdrawal of half the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan?
Well, I support that, again, if it's done responsibly. I do not support the way the president approached Syria. Just want to clarify that, because he had no agreement with Erdogan to protect the Kurds and to make sure that Turkey didn't annex part of Syria. We should have had a much better negotiation and diplomacy before our withdrawal. Same thing when it comes to Afghanistan. I do think that we ought to bring our troops home. When we had the surge in 2008, the Taliban controlled about 40% of the territory. Today, the Taliban controls 70% of the territory. It is not possible with 14,000 troops for us to prevent or retake Afghanistan and not allow the Taliban there. It would take hundreds of thousands of troops to do that. And I don't think the American people want that, nor is that in our security interests. So we should withdraw, but we need to understand and have diplomacy, a regional diplomacy that involves Pakistan, that involves India, that involves China and Russia and other players to make sure that we have some vigilance against emerging terrorism, which, by the way, isn't just in Afghanistan, but much of it is across the border in Pakistan. So this idea that if we withdraw our troops, that there may be some other attack, well, those attacks are being planned not just where they happened in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan.
And what about Yemen? You have been a leader on calling for the U.S. to stop supporting the Saudi bombing of Yemen. We have this new news from Nick Turse at Yahoo News. He writes, newly obtained documents reveal the United States has also been training coalition military personnel from the United Arab Emirates for the air war in Yemen.
I thought Nick's reporting was brilliant. It was the first clear reporting about our complicity in that war, not just with the Saudis, but also with the United Arab Emirates. The reality is very simple, Amy, as you know. I mean, there are 14 million Yemenis who face the possibility of famine. This is not because the world doesn't have enough food and medicine. There are many agencies who want to get food and medicine to the Yemeni civilians. But it's because the Saudis and the coalition, including the United Arab Emirates, have been bombing the port of Hodeidah and not allowing food and medicine to get in. And that's led to extraordinary inflation in Yemen. And kids are not getting basic nutrition. There's not basic medicine. We need to bring an end to this war. Fortunately, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer have both given a commitment that as soon as we can vote, the shutdown is over, we're going to bring the War Powers Resolution for a vote in the House. It's going to pass, and Bernie Sanders is going to bring it back in the Senate. It will pass. It'll be the first time that a War Powers Resolution has passed in the House and the Senate in opposition to the White House, and it will be a clear signal to end this war.
Now let's talk about the government shutdown and the pain that it is causing, not just the 800,000 federal workers who are not being paid, so many of them being forced to work and work overtime but are not receiving paychecks. I'd like to get your response to that. Also, after Nancy Pelosi told President Trump he shouldn't be giving a State of the Union address at this time, it's dangerous with the whole government, many in government in one place, that he should give it in writing, which has precedent, or at the Oval Office or at another time. And then in response, Trump canceling a military flight Thursday that was set to deliver the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and congressional delegation to visit NATO and also troops in Afghanistan. Pelosi leading the delegation that included chairs of the House Intelligence and Veterans Affairs Committee. His 11th hour order causing the bus carrying the delegation to turn around on its way to the airport. He said she could take a commercial flight to Afghanistan, but also, in writing that letter, exposed that they were going to Afghanistan.
Well, it's outrageous and it's petty, and it may be a turning point in the entire debate. I mean, the president is using personal retaliation against the speaker. He's not standing up for a cause. It actually reminds me of when Newt Gingrich said that he shut down government because he wasn't allowed to exit from the front of Air Force One, and the press labeled him a crybaby because he made it something so petty, and that's what the president is doing. And substantively, there are those of us in Congress, progressives, who actually want to help the president get out of Afghanistan and make the case to our own leadership that there's a responsible way of withdrawing troops. Let me tell you, he's not helping himself when he's denying the speaker the opportunity to go to Afghanistan. And this is not a tit-for-tat situation. The speaker has said that the president can come for the State of the Union. It should be whenever we stop the shutdown, because the Department of Homeland Security personnel aren't being paid, and it would be unfair for them. The president is doing something that is totally vindictive and wrong. The military is being paid, and this is a time-sensitive mission to Afghanistan in light of his own calls to withdraw troops. In terms of the broader economic damage. I mean, I meet people all the time from my district and in the community who are really hurting. I mean, they're going without paychecks. They are unable to make mortgage payments or unable to pay, in some cases, for their kids' college education. I mean, this is having a real impact, and it's having a real impact on the economy. The president's own economic advisors are saying that we're losing 0.1% of GDP growth every week this shutdown goes on. And we already have had a slowdown potentially in the economy. This may be a policy that unfortunately drives us into recession, which would be terrible given that it's totally self-inflicted.
Let me ask you about a vote that did take place this week. The House of Representatives voting 424-1 to condemn white nationalism and white supremacy in a rebuke to Iowa Republican Congressmember Steve King. It wasn't a formal censure of King, who's made similar remarks throughout his 16-year career in Congress. Can you comment on what he said?
Well, it's so appalling, it's so outrageous that he should resign. But I think your point, Amy, is a very good one, that this is not a unique situation. Doug Burns, who's a journalist in Steve King's district, has a piece where he chronicles that Steve King has been saying the same thing about white supremacy for the past 10 years, and there hasn't been any action. I'm glad he's been stripped of the committees, but I just don't see how someone of his views, which is blatantly racist, can continue to serve in 21st century America.
Will you be pushing for a censure?
I will be. Tim Ryan has been leading the charge for a censure. I'm hopeful that this will be a bipartisan basis censure. I don't see how anyone can really stand for what Steve King represents.
I want to thank you very much for being with us, Silicon Valley Congressmember Ro Khanna from California, leading critic of U.S. military interventions abroad. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined in studio by the foreign minister of Venezuela. Stay with us. Is a coup against President Maduro in the works?
We could be the healing when you're feeling all alone. We can be the reason to find the strength to carry on. In a world that's so divided, we shall overcome. We can be the healing. We can be the flower in the gun. We can be the healing. We could be the flower in the gun. What could I say to my son and to my daughter?
Michael Franti and Spearhead performing their new single, The Flower, featuring Victoria Canal. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The United States and allied nations in Latin America are ratcheting up pressure on Venezuela in what appears to be a coordinated effort to remove Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from office. Maduro was sworn in last week to a second six-year term following his victory in last May's election, which was boycotted by the opposition. Days before Maduro was sworn in, opposition figure Juan Guaido became head of the National Assembly, which soon voted to declare Maduro a usurper in an effort to remove him from office. The United States, Brazil, and other nations have welcomed the effort. Vice President Mike Pence tweeted, "The U.S. strongly supports the courageous decision by Juan Guaido to declare the country's presidency vacant." On the day of Maduro's inauguration, January 10th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Guaido to congratulate him on his election victory to head the National Assembly. Then National Security Advisor John Bolton announced, quote, "The United States does not recognize Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro's illegitimate claim to power," unquote. Brazil, now led by the far-right president Jair Bolsonaro, has gone a step further by saying it recognizes Juan Guaido as the rightful president of Venezuela, even though Guaido himself hasn't even claimed that title. A group of Latin American countries known as the Lima Group also recently voted to not recognize the legitimacy of Maduro's presidency. Mexico was the sole dissenter. The U.S.-led effort targeting the oil-rich nation of Venezuela dates back 2 decades since the late Hugo Chavez became president in 1999. In November, John Bolton accused Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua of being part of a troika of tyranny. In September, the New York Times reported the Trump administration conducted secret meetings with rebellious military officers in Venezuela to discuss overthrowing Maduro. In August, Maduro survived an assassination attempt when he was attacked by a small drone. He accused the U.S. and Colombia of being involved in the plot. In 2017, President Donald Trump said he could not rule out a, quote, military option to deal with Venezuela. All of this comes as Venezuela is facing a staggering economic crisis caused in part by falling oil prices and broad U.S. sanctions. According to the IMF, inflation is over 1,000,000% in the last year, the highest rate in the world. There are widespread reports of food and medicine shortages. The United Nations estimates 3 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela since 2015, resulting in what the UN has described as an unprecedented migration crisis in Latin America. As the political turmoil intensifies, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has reached out to the United Nations to help establish a peace dialogue in Venezuela. Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza met this week with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres here in New York. On Thursday, I had a chance to interview Foreign Minister Ariaza, who has served as foreign minister for the past 3 years. From 2013 to 16, he served as Venezuela's vice president. I began by asking him if he believes Venezuela is being set up for a coup.
Of course, it's evident. And you see, this man who nobody knows in Venezuela, you ask in the streets who is Juan Guaidó, and nobody knows him, but he's been pushed to say that he is the new president by the U.S. He hasn't said that. But Pompeo says it, Almagro from the OAS says it, and other presidents say that now he's the president. Aman. They are trying to push a political conflict in Venezuela. They are calling the armed forces to make pronunciations against President Maduro. That's what they want, a coup d'etat in Venezuela. They want a war in Venezuela, and it's not going to happen.
So let's talk more about what you believe is the role of the United States in coalescing opposition to Maduro.
They are the bosses of the opposition. They tell them what to do. Nothing that the opposition does is without the permission or authorization of the State Department, at least here in the United States. And they confess this. They say, well, we have to make consultations with the embassy. We have to make consultations with the Department of State. It happens. I mean, they are not free. They are not independent. So, but in spite of all of that, the president is trying to sit again with the opposition, with the democratic opposition, not the extremist opposition that makes violent demonstrations and burns people alive. No, and that is what he's going to insist on, the dialogue. But what's happening now, John Bolton tweeting and doing communiques, and Pompeo and everyone saying that Maduro is not the president, that he's illegitimate, that he's a usurper. Come on. That is a coup d'etat again against Venezuela.
Well, explain that term, a usurper. I mean, it looks like a case is being built for an overthrow. And when Guaidó, the opposition, the head of the National Assembly, announces that Maduro is a usurper.
I mean, they are manipulating the Venezuelan constitution. They say that the elections were almost 10 million Venezuelans voted, and more than 6 million voted for Maduro, that this didn't happen. No?
The opposition boycotted.
Yes, they boycotted it. Not only the opposition, the Washington and Bogota and Lima and Santiago, these governments, neoliberal governments in Latin America. So they said, when the elections were conveyed, 3 months before the elections, they said they're going to be a fraud, and they wouldn't recognize the results. And then they pressed the potential candidates of the opposition not to register. And when some of them registered, they pressed them to retire, to withdraw, and they didn't. And now they say that because the elections were a fraud, then there's no president in Venezuela, so the president of the National Assembly has to be the new president, and all these governments and the U.S. government are encouraging this thesis. So it's very dangerous.
I want to continue on what the U.S. is doing. In November, National Security Advisor John Bolton claimed Venezuela was part of a troika of tyranny.
The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has finally met its match. In Venezuela, the United States is acting against the dictator Maduro, who uses the same oppressive tactics that have been employed in Cuba for decades. He has installed an illegitimate constituent assembly, debased the currency for political gain, and forced his people to sign up for a corrupt food distribution service or face certain starvation.
In December, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro accused U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton of leading a plan to invade Venezuela.
Today I come out once again to denounce the plot set forth by the U.S. to destroy Venezuela's democracy, to assassinate me, and to impose a dictatorship in Venezuela. Mr. John Bolton has been assigned, once again, as the chief of a plot to fill Venezuela with violence and to seek a foreign military intervention, a coup, assassinate President Maduro, and impose what they call a transitory government.
Foreign Minister, can you elaborate on this and also this term troika of tyranny, very much reminiscent of George W. Bush's axis of evil.
No? And the reminiscence of the language used in the Cold War, Nixon, McCarthy, all that dark history, no? And it has no sense. We're in the 21st century. You have to respect the sovereign nations. We have the right to build our own model, democratic model, and yes, the United States government, and especially the obsession of John Bolton against President Maduro, they are behind everything that is happening in Venezuela. Yes, they almost assassinated President Maduro August the 4th with drones. And
well, let's talk about this. This was the first drone attack, attempted assassination on a head of state in history.
Yes.
August 4th, it was a Saturday. It was in front of the Palace of Justice.
Yes.
Maduro was giving a speech. And explain exactly what happened.
What happened is that suddenly a drone appeared, and it exploded.
Were you there?
I wasn't there. But most of the ministers were there, and the military forces were there, and the other branches of power were there. And it was 2 drones. These people were trained in Colombia. We gave this information to the Colombian government. We gave them the place where they were trained, the people who were involved, the names of the people, of the officials of migration that led them cross to Venezuela with the drones. We gave the U.S. government the information about these people in Miami who met there and also were part of this plot against President Maduro, and nothing happened.
Well, before it, in April, at the Latin American Summit in Lima, Peru, Vice President Mike Pence said more must be done to isolate Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro.
We must all stand with our brothers and sisters suffering in Venezuela. And I can promise you the United States will not rest. We will not relent until democracy is restored in Venezuela and the Venezuelan people reclaim their birthright of libertad.
So that's Vice President Mike Pence. In June, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro called U.S. Vice President Mike Pence a viper and vowed to defeat what he called Washington's attempts to force him from power.
Every time the poisonous viper of Mike Pence opens his mouth, I feel stronger, clearer of what the road is. The road is ours. It is Venezuelan. It is not the one Mike Pence points out to us. Not 20 poisonous snakes. Not 20 vipers like Mike Pence.
Foreign Minister Adriaza, explain. What is Mike Pence's particular interest here? You're looking at Pence, Bolton, and Pompeo now, Secretary of State.
Well, Pence, he's a religious guy. He's from the extreme right, you know him. And he's obsessed as well with the Venezuelan revolution. And you see, they say that you have to restore democracy in Venezuela. We have a democracy. We have had 25 elections in 20 years. We've had elections for president in 1998, in 2000, 2004, 2006, in 2009, 2012, 2013, 2018. I mean, our people are used to, and not only the democracy, because the Constitution says you have to elect these presidents and parliament members and mayors and governors. No, because we have, our society is organized in community councils, consejos comunales, and communes, and you take the decisions. Every single day Venezuelans are exercising democracy. We have democratized the access to education, which was being privatized before the revolution. We have democratized access to housing, which was also exclusive for the rich before the revolution. We have democratized access to health. We have doctors all over. They used to be Cubans, now they're Venezuelans, all over the country. You walk one block and you have the doctor there. So we are really trying to build a root democracy rooted in the people, and that is what they don't like, because that is not what they would like from the countries of Latin America.
I want to talk about sanctions and the effect they're having on the Venezuelan economy. You have Henry Kissinger, still an elder statesman consulted by Democrats and Republicans alike. Let's go back half a century, go back decades. He wanted to make the Chilean economy under Allende scream, he said. You have the half-century embargo against Cuba. What does economic pressure, economic sabotage, if you will, look like in Venezuela? In November, the Congressional Research Service published a short overview of current U.S. sanctions in Venezuela and mentions the Trump administration is considering a new wave of sanctions. But the report also states, quote, although stronger economic sanctions could influence the Venezuelan government's behavior, they also could have negative effects and unintended consequences. Analysts are concerned that stronger sanctions could exacerbate Venezuela's difficult humanitarian situation, which has been marked by shortages of food and medicines, increased poverty, and mass migration. Many Venezuelan civil society groups oppose sanctions that could worsen humanitarian conditions. Now, again, this is not the Venezuelan president saying this. This is the U.S. Congressional Research Service. Can you talk about the effect of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela?
The Venezuelan people are suffering because of these so-called sanctions, which are coercive unilateral measures. This is not approved by the United Nations Security Council. It has no legality. These are decisions taken by one government unilaterally to impose a blockade against Venezuela, so it's difficult for us to import food, to import medicine. We cannot use the dollar as a currency to exchange. We have to switch. Only this switching from dollars to euros is more than what we need to invest in importing the vaccines for our children or the treatment for HIV in Venezuela for 2 years. And it's probably, the figure that I can give you is more than $20,000 million that we have lost because of these so-called sanctions in more than a year.
So these sanctions are overt. Are there covert sanctions against Venezuela?
Of course, because it's not only this that is official. It's pressing the companies not to work with Venezuela. It's threatening to seize a company that we have here in the United States, Citgo. We cannot repatriate the profit from our company in the United States to invest it in food, in medicine in Venezuela.
And for people to know, Citgo, which is Venezuelan state oil company, yes, has been used for many years in the United States to support poor people in their programs to have oil in the winter.
And we intend to keep on using it for this in the United States, but most of the profit annually should be sent to Venezuela, and we cannot do it. It has to be here in the banks in the United States, blocked. We have more than $1,600 million or euros blocked in Europe in this company intermediaries called Euroclear. Why? Because of the sanctions.
You mentioned Russia. On Wednesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov expressed concerns over U.S. meddling in Venezuela.
Yes.
We've heard talk that allows for military involvement in Venezuela. talk that the United States will now recognize as the president of Venezuela, not Nicolas Maduro, but the representative of the parliament. All this is very alarming, and all this shows is that the approach of undermining governments the United States doesn't like stays on as a priority of their activity in Latin America and in other regions.
If you can talk about the significance of Lavrov weighing in. Also, the latest news in December, Russia landing 2 nuclear-capable blackjack bombers in Venezuela as part of a joint training exercise.
It's, you know, Russia has been friends of Venezuela for over 16 years. We believe that the world has to have several poles, several centers, not only the United States. The United States cut all the military cooperation with Venezuela 20 years ago, and we have military cooperation with Russia. And these planes, aircrafts that came this year, they came in 2013 as well, and nothing happened. But this year it was taken like it was this. We were trying to bomb the U.S. and come on, that's nonsense. We have the right to have cooperation with Russia, with China, with whatever country in the world. And what Lavrov said there is exactly what the United States is doing. And he knows that they are trying to manipulate the people, the media, the constitution of Venezuela, even to impose a man who's not being elected president.
Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza. We'll be back with him in 30 seconds.
Se escuchó al final de un duro siglo, otra voz en América, redescubrir, debatir del sueño de liberación, una nueva verdad.
This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue with my interview with the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza. You have massive flight from Venezuela. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has called the ongoing Venezuelan migration crisis unprecedented in Latin America. The UN estimates about 3 million Venezuelans have left since 2015. Another 2 million are projected to leave this year. About 1 million of them are living in Colombia. 500,000 Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, Panama, Brazil all have large numbers. Why, Foreign Minister Arreaza, are so many people, so many Venezuelans leaving?
Well, first, it's not... you know how many Colombians live in Venezuela? 6 million Colombians live in Venezuela. Over Peruvians and Ecuadorians, over 1 million. Spaniards, Italians, Portuguese, Arabs, over 2 million. So, of course, there is migration at the moment because we are blocked, because it's difficult to find medicine, to find some products of food, and the hyperinflation process with an exchange rate, Amy, that is not set by the national authorities in Venezuela, by the central bank. It's set by web pages in Miami. You know, the exchange rate the day before Maduro's inauguration was $1, 1,000 bolivars, which is crazy. Well, the day of the inauguration, it duplicated. It was 2,000 bolivars for $1. And that has no economic logic. That is all political. That is warfare. That is using the currency against our own people. So we are worried, of course, because there are Venezuelans. It's not 3 million Venezuelans. It's probably 1 million Venezuelans. And most of the people that have gone to Colombia are Colombians that live in Venezuela and that have gone back to their country. And we are willing them to come back to Venezuela. That's what we want for the Venezuelans and the Colombians that lived in Venezuela to come back to Venezuela.
But the economy, inflation over 1,000,000% last year, the highest rate in the world.
That's the figure of the IMF. That's not the exact. That's not the figure at all. It's probably 10 times less than that. It's a very difficult problem. But this inflation is induced from abroad. It is produced by these web pages and all this warfare, economic warfare against Venezuela. It is not only because we have not taken some measures in Venezuela. Of course it's not. And it makes things very difficult for the Venezuelan people.
So food and medicine shortages, do you feel that your government, the Maduro government, takes some responsibility for what's taking place?
We're not perfect. As the government here is not perfect at all, and the government in Argentina is not perfect. Of course, we have responsibilities, but most of the problem, the vast majority of the problems in Venezuela are caused by the blockade, are caused by the warfare, economic warfare against Venezuela. And in spite of all of that, we are in a better situation today than we were in 2016. There is more food, there is more medicine, there's more, the employment is under unemployment is under 6%, and many things. I mean, we have not closed one school, one university, one hospital. We have not expelled the Cuban doctors because we have to protect our people. We have delivered more than 2,500,000 houses to our people in the last 4 years, and that is investment that we have made in spite of the sanctions, in spite of the blockade against Venezuela.
So let me ask you about Human Rights Watch and the Venezuelan NGO Foro Penal recently releasing a report accusing Venezuelan intelligence and security forces of detaining and torturing military personnel accused of plotting against the government. The report claims, quote, some detainees were subjected to egregious abuses that amount to torture to force them to provide information about alleged conspiracies.
That's psychological warfare against Venezuela. Of course, there are detainees that were in plots last year to overthrow President Maduro, but no one is torturing them. This happened in the last century in Venezuela. We were used to torture. We were used to students being killed in the streets every week. We were used to repression. That stopped with the Bolivarian Revolution. It doesn't happen anymore. But these NGOs are paid also by the USAID and by the government of the United States, and they say what they have to say because they are paid.
So I want to ask you about other leaders in Latin America. On the one hand, you have Brazil's far-right president now, Jair Bolsonaro, and Argentina's President Mauricio Macri meeting to discuss joint opposition to the Venezuelan government. And then you have the newly elected president of Mexico, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is not joining with these other countries who are opposing Venezuela. But first talk about the Macri-Bolsonaro alliance and what that means, joining with the U.S.
Yes, as I told you, in Latin America, it's like a company, a corporation. Trump is the CEO of a corporation, and these presidents who are businessmen are his directors, and they want to be promoted by President Trump. So they have to follow the orders, and they have been said that they have to isolate Maduro, that they have to not recognize Maduro as government, and they have to do what the United States says so in order to overthrow Maduro. And that's what they're doing. Of course, we are worried about Brazil because this man is far on the right. It's fascism again. It's what we felt, that what we believed to have disappeared from the Latin America in history, it's happening again. This man hates women. This man hates the black population. This man hates the homosexual community. This man hates the Venezuelans. He's a racist. We are worried about Brazil. He hates the poor, but
loves the former Brazilian military dictatorship.
Yes, he loves the dictatorship.
And what does it mean to you that AMLO, the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the stance he has taken in support of Venezuela?
I believe that the president of Mexico is right. We have to respect each other. We have to respect the principles of international law. I mean, if you join the United Nations, it's because you respect the internal affairs of the other states. It's because you respect the equality of states. It's because you don't have the right to interfere in other nations. That's not what the United States does. They have done wars in Iraq. President Trump said that we regretted that the United States invaded Iraq. Iraq, because now the situation is worse than it was with Saddam Hussein, and the same in Libya.
And yet you see the same thing happening, and of course a very serious similarity. You have George W. Bush coining the term, or his people writing the term, and him saying it in 2002, axis of evil, which set up the foundation for the invasion of Iraq. And then you have the U.S. talking about the troika of tyranny, and the similarities between Iraq and Venezuela are 3 letters, oil. And interestingly, many years ago, the original name of the invasion of Iraq was going to be Operation Iraqi Liberation. But they realized the acronym was oil, and they had to change it. That was the United States. But what about this similarity, this resource, focusing on countries that are, the world's most important oil providers?
I am sure that if in Venezuela we only had bananas, none of this intervention would be happening. But we have oil, we have gas, we have gold, we have silver, we have bauxite, we have iron, we have water. I mean, Venezuela is a very rich, wealthy nation, and that is why they want to rule the country again, as they did until 1998. They want to have control of the Venezuelan resources, and that is why they are so obsessed to overthrow Maduro, because they want to have these resources for the development of capitalism here in the United States.
What do you think this coup will look like if it takes place?
First of all, it cannot take place because we have to defend our constitution, and we have to defend the peace of the Venezuelan people. And the military forces in Venezuela are aligned with the constitution. They support the constitution, and as a consequence of that, they support the legitimate president, who is Nicolás Maduro, no doubt about it. So it won't happen. But what they would like to happen is that some militaries say that Maduro is not the president anymore, and then that they will appoint this young fellow Guaidó as president with no constitutional support, and then they will have control of PDVSA, of the oil of Venezuela. You said it, the oil. They will have control of the companies on Venezuela, of the resources, the gold and everything, and they believe that is possible. That's not possible. Not in Venezuela. Maybe in some other country, but not in Venezuela.
I'm looking at a tweet that just came over from Florida Senator Marco Rubio. He says, we must support those members of military in Venezuela who have announced they will defend the Constitution and recognize Guaidó as legitimate interim president. That's the president of the National Assembly.
Yes. You know that those are supposed to be military people. They live in Peru. They don't live in Venezuela.
You're talking about the picture he tweeted out.
That's a video
of military men.
That's a video that last night came, and it's supposed to be Venezuelan militaries who live in Peru. I mean, that's part of the show. They are probably paid, maybe by the Peruvian government, I don't know. They are in the Peruvian TV, but that's not happening in Venezuela. That's what Marco Rubio wants, that this were to happen in Venezuela, that the military were to announce that they don't recognize President Maduro. That's not going to happen. And if it were to happen, a small group, we are ready for any scenario. But they want a coup d'etat in Venezuela. That's a good proof of what Bolton, Pence, and Trump, and Marco Rubio want for Venezuela.
Well, let me ask you about the issue of press freedom in Venezuela. In December, the 75-year-old newspaper El Nacional published its last issue. It was the largest remaining opposition newspaper publishing in Venezuela. The Committee to Protect Journalists reported the closure was due to restrictions that the government imposed on access to newsprint. According to CPJ, over 20 Venezuelan publications have been forced out of print due to government restrictions on newsprint. Natalie Southwick of CPJ said, quote, the disappearance of El Nacional's print edition is the latest casualty of the Venezuelan government's ever-expanding campaign to silence critical reporting and limit the voices of independent media in the country.
You know, before all this economical trouble and problems we used to subsidize the imports of paper for the newspapers. And now it's the private newspapers that have to import their own newspaper, and it's more expensive. So that's what happened to El Nacional. But El Nacional, you can check the social networks, you can check Twitter, you can put in Google, you can Google kill Maduro, matar Maduro, maldito Maduro, and it's all over all the media in Venezuela. The radio stations, newspapers, TV broadcasting channels of the opposition, probably 70% of the media in Venezuela, which is private, is against the government and encouraging all these situations to happen because they are owned by the wealthy families, traditional wealthy families of Venezuela. But I mean, that's part of the show, saying that in Venezuela there's no free press and freedom of speech.
But what about the shutting down of this almost 24 papers?
That's not true.
El Nacional is not.
They bankrupt. They don't have enough money. They don't sell enough newspaper in order to have money to import their own paper.
For a non-Venezuelan audience, how would you define the Bolivarian revolution? I mean, you are the foreign minister under Maduro. You're also the son-in-law of Hugo Chavez. Talk about that history.
The history of the Bolivarian Revolution is a process of independence, of giving back to people their rights, of guaranteeing that the people have access to health, to education, to housing, to culture, to their national identity, to their sovereignty. That is the Venezuelan revolution, democratizing our society, really democratizing the human rights in Venezuela. That is what we're trying to do, using the wealth of the oil and the other natural resources to invest it in the people, for the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. That's our mean, that's our goal, that's what's happening. But because those resources are not for the U.S., are not for other interests in the world, they are trying to overthrow President Chavez and then President Maduro, and they will continue. President Maduro would like to have a conversation with President Trump, and it would probably solve some issues, because I am sure that when if they were to talk and see each other to the eyes, they would see that they can coexist and they can fulfill some agreements between them. But there's no way. I haven't been able to have a meeting with not with Pompeo, who is like a Minister of Foreign Affairs, no? With no one in the State Department. They don't want to have dialogue with the Venezuelan authorities. What's that? That's not civilized.
Final question, and this is about the International Criminal Court. In September, Argentina, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, Peru called on the ICC to investigate Venezuela. Human Rights Watch hailed the move, saying in 2 crackdowns in 2014 and 2017, Venezuelan security forces committed systematic abuses against critics, including torture. Human Rights Watch research shows they detained more than 5,400 people between April and July 2017. Members of the security forces have beaten detainees severely and tortured them with electric shocks, asphyxiation, sexual assault, and other brutal techniques.
That's part also of the show. Now, you can compare the human rights record of Venezuela with Argentina or Brazil or any of these countries that are manipulating the international institutions and using them to attack Venezuela. We are waiting for Michelle Bachelet, who is the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations, to visit Venezuela.
Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, a torture survivor herself.
Yes, she is. And she's been invited by President Maduro, and we're waiting for her to come to Venezuela and to see the situation by herself. Of course, this is part of the warfare against Venezuela, but as I told you, this is going to be part of the past, Amy. These governments, right-wing governments in Latin America, are going to be over. Some of them this year, some of them next year, and Venezuela is going to be there. At least the revolution.
How do you explain this right-wing wave throughout Latin America, of course excluding Mexico?
Yes, Mexico, Bolivia, Nicaragua, the Caribbean nations, they have popular governments as well. But Uruguay, of course, has a progressive government as well. But it's part of the cycles. No, it's part of the cycles. But I must say that the United States was focused on the Middle East after 9/11, and they invested all these funds and money, and suddenly the progressive governments became majority in Latin America, and when they turned their head, they say, hey, what's happening here. We have to do something. We have to do a coup d'etat in Honduras because this Zelaya is trying to do a progressive government. We have to fund the candidates of the right. We have to. So they have had success until now, but the peoples of Latin America are seeing, are witnessing this, and they will change the conditions. They will change because the peoples have the right to be in power in Latin America.
Jorge Arriaza, Venezuelan foreign minister. He was here in New York to meet with the UN Secretary General. He's also the former vice president of Venezuela and the son-in-law of the late President Hugo Chavez. That does it for our broadcast. Happy birthday to Edith Penty. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digest each day, you can text the word Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866, or go to our website and sign up at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Geister, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, Tay-Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.